Well, good morning, everybody. I wanted to start off today by talking a bit about Mexico. Yesterday, when I was in St. Louis, I ran into a colleague and friend of mine, Eric Kunzman, and we had a discussion about his recent trip to Belize. Now, Belize isn't shown on the map. It's right here. It's just south of kind of this part of the Yucatan Peninsula. But a lot of the discussion as he was traveling down in that part of the world was about the water resources and how many places are very close to running out of water. And this, of course, extends up into a very extensive dryness into central Mexico that's come up into north central Mexico and gotten its way into parts of the desert southwest of the United States. I focused a lot in recent videos on what the implications of this could be for U.S. weather as we go forward into spring, but it's important to note that we have to consider how the shifting of this drought is going to influence the pattern across all of North America. So we're going to spend just a moment this morning talking about that before I get into an update on the pattern, the big western ridge, how long it's going to last, and then have a discussion about what the temperatures I think are going to look like going in through the rest of this month, as well as the precip pattern. So that's kind of my plan for today. Now, the map I've been pointing at, this is the North American Drought Monitor map. And just to be clear, this map only comes out once a month. It always has data on it through the end of the month. So it's old. We'll get a new one of these on like June 16th. And it will show some changes across the United States and the Canadian prairie, but I don't think that's going to show much change at all across Central America. I want to add to this a look at the GRACE. This is a satellite named GRACE, Grace-Based Root Zone Soil Moisture. It's a drought indicator map created by measuring fluctuations over time in gravity, which kind of helps us understand water flow. And this is looking at their root zone soil moisture map. And it's just to point out that starting all the way from Central America, going through the western states into kind of Western Canada, we've started to see this this backing off of water supply, not just here in the root zone, but you can actually choose between that surface soil moisture and groundwater. And if you look at the groundwater, this is where we just start to see some of the early season threats that need to be discussed and kind of put into our whole forecasting mindset going forward. So that's another way to look at it. And the last way I want to show you here by looking at some historical data is going to the temperature pattern. Because over the last month, we have seen temperatures in Mexico, nudging down here towards Central America, that have been averaging 7 to 15 degrees above normal. And over a 30-day stretch, that is a very, very large anomaly. Probably this means the last month would have been maybe the warmest May on record and possibly their driest as well once we get some of that data in. Now, what concerns me is I did go back and look preliminarily at some of the data, and the last time I saw such extensive dryness in May was in 1998. And in 1998, I don't know if you all remember this, but we had a lot of late season activity with respect to hurricanes that came through the Caribbean, and one of them was named Mitch. And Mitch is one of the deadliest kind of Western Hemisphere hurricanes in history. And so we have to continue to consider how warm the waters are here and what a shift in the ridging to the north could do to let more of the flow from the Caribbean get into Mexico, potentially sending them over to what could be a very wet pattern at some point midsummer. That's just a thought, and we're going to come back to that repeatedly, I think, over the next several weeks. I was looking at some satellite data this morning as the sun was rising, and you can see some of the haze from the smoke. But if I go back to yesterday, we are getting convection in the mountains. The mountains are doing their thing, blowing up these huge storms. But these storms are brief. They put down locally very heavy rainfall. And then if you follow that up with temperatures as high as they have been, you quickly deplete through evaporation the moisture that was just returned. We can also very clearly see the amount of smoke that is throughout this part of Mexico coming from these wildfires. And I zoomed in just to have a look at some of those from yesterday. So we can see many of these wildfires right here, just adding a tremendous amount of smoke into the lower atmosphere. And this is very close to a city with over 25 million people in it. And so just very concerning about the extensiveness of the drought in Mexico. As we think about what this has done to the lower atmosphere, it is important to note that the humidity levels over the last month have been off between 15 and 30%. I know my color bar only goes to 15, but some places here have been over 30% drier than normal in the lower atmosphere humidity profile. And to be honest, this is what has set up what has been one of the most vigorous severe storm seasons. We've had this dry air pumping into this section of the southwestern United States into New Mexico and Texas, but we've had plenty of Gulf moisture just to its east. And that's what's given us this repeated event along the U.S. dry line here of just ripping off these large storms. And they've built into the moisture that's been in Texas, whereas eastern Texas versus western Texas has had two entirely different precipitation regimes this spring. Now, that's normal, but eastern Texas is like record wet for the last 2 months, like the wettest we've seen in 132 years. And so there's just questions that need to follow this as to where this is going to go because of this. Now, let's just spend a moment on this graphic. You've seen it from me before. I've blown it up to the northern kind of hemisphere view, but I want to zoom in on North America. This has been the most important part of this pattern. It's been this kind of high pressure that at times has kind of run back and forth here with a low to the south of it over and north of Hawaii and a low here in kind of the Bering Sea in Alaska. And what this has done is this has accelerated the jet stream here. It's run over the periphery of the ridge down into the southwest United States, and it's ejected. What has helped the speed of this has been this larger ridge feature that's sat over Mexico that's causing them drought. So when you link together the culprits behind this severe weather season, it's mainly been what's been going on in Mexico with a large ridge, the low that's north of Hawaii, contrasting with the large ridge that sat here over the very warm water. We looked at that many times, right? And the low over Alaska. So you could say what's set up the western United States for a deep trough that's ejected over the mountains, causing day after day after day of severe weather, has been the product of Mexico, Hawaii, and Alaska. That trio of high and low pressure systems is what set things up. So anything that could possibly change this pattern may begin here, or it could also start over here. Because the one thing that could have made this worse, made this actually a worse severe weather season, is if we would have seen additional ridging from the Bermuda High, especially if that Bermuda High ridge would have pushed in toward the east, which would have sent the east into drought and even amplified this pattern more. But the Bermuda High is not there, and it's split. There's a piece of it that's way over in Europe, and there's a piece of it that's here. We've been looking at that for the last couple of weeks. So just to kind of continue on with this, we've got questions as to how this whole pattern continues to evolve. And so I'm going to go straight to the long range here for a moment. And I want to show you using the European weeklies as we work our way toward mid-June, what the weeklies are looking at in terms of the pattern. And here's that large ridge that's been over Mexico. Take note that the big ridge that comes into the west that's there right now, they don't have it lasting through mid-June. No model really does. And as a result, we get back into flow where instead of keeping a ridge axis here, it seems to be moving into this area. Now, what I'll be concerned about is as we get out there through the end of June, there's the solstice, getting into the very end of June to beginning of July, the models continue to kind of open up this 591 decameter ridge in this area. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. If you were to look at the climatological average 500 millibar flow, it looks something like this. But it's the coloring that's important, showing higher than the historical averages on heights. So this might push the jet stream north sooner. And as we get out here, I'll have to stop this on the evening of the 4th of July. So maybe when we're watching fireworks here, what I'll be watching is this line labeled 588. When you think historically, it's been that 588 line that comes over the ridge and rolls through this area. That in and around that 588 line, once you get fully into the summer pattern, we get these little short waves that kind of roll over the top of the bigger ridge. And they initiate thunderstorms and give us a corridor that sometimes opens up like this of a lot of stormy weather. And sometimes it starts clear up in Canada. It can be anywhere. But that 588 height line seems to be a critical one to be watching. So what I'm concerned about is this builds a lot of heat into this area. But storms run the periphery like this. And if we take a look, let's go to the temperature forecast. You've seen this many times in my videos, but just watch. There's now, playing forward to the end of June, we can see how the heat is opening up in the midsection of the country. And the question is, does it anchor in here, like somewhere between Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Kansas? And if it does the upper level ridge sit here and we just get storms that cascade over the top of this? That is a very real possibility with this pattern as we stretch it out here in the models through the middle of July. Now, what could make this different? What could really change the position of this ridge is one thing in my opinion right now. And that is this. Let's go to the current ocean temperatures. And what could make this different is if this warmth stays here only. In other words, this starts to erode, cool. If that occurs, that ridge in Kansas becomes a ridge in Iowa. And we'll see a complementary ridge that sits up here. We'll get into the triple ridge pattern in summer, which will be a disaster for central U.S. crops. Now, we're not calling for that yet. We're actually calling for a hot and stormy summer because the warmer water has moved toward like Washington and British Columbia. But there is still some fragility with this pattern, suggesting that it could make a move toward setting up with a bulge in the jet stream coming out of Mexico, living more near the 100th meridian, not over the western mountains, and as a result change the precipitation pattern across the rest of the country. And I can't make a confident statement about it right now. It's not possible, but you just now know what I'm keeping a close eye on. So let's come back to here. And as we look at the forecast on precip, this will be the 30 days ending. Why don't we just take it out there to the 14th of July. While you see drier in this area, we could get a lot of storms cascading over the top of this as we discussed. And take note of this. That's got me thinking. Because if the models are consistent and have a lot of moisture getting into and resulting in rain and big storms in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, this is something that could start us off, in late June and early July with an active kind of homegrown hurricane setup. When I say homegrown, I'm just talking about close to the U.S. coast. But take note of what the model is doing here. It's storming Mexico, it's storming the Canadian Prairie, it's storming all through this corridor and through here and storming up the East Coast. The risk of the heat and drought is going to be where that larger ridge ends up living. And that's the big thinking here. Now, right now, you saw this a moment ago, over the next 15 days, this is why we're not talking about the MJO very much right now. It's not moving. There's just a lot of rising motion happening here. And what's interesting is if you kind of just look at some of the maps with this, I'll pull up this one. This is the day 11 through 15. If we're getting that rising motion in this area, we have to start to consider what that could mean towards some early convection that could result in some early tropical development in that area, and also what this could do to spread rain into Mexico. It's like taking the lid off of the atmosphere here. But notice it's across much of North America as well. And that's why some of the longer range models, I showed you the European, which looks pretty dry, but other models like the CFSV2 have picked up on that stormier pattern in this corridor. That would be the week 3, that's the 19th through the 25th. And here's week 4, still seeing a lot more storm activity than anything else. So I just wanted to get that out and talk about that longer range idea based upon things that are happening in Mexico. With that, we'll kind of get back into the near term now. Coming back to kind of a North American view, this morning we watched a large complex of storms roll right through here. And our main frontal boundary, look how sharp the divide is here in the clouds on the backside of this where things start to clear out. Yesterday, just kind of looking at where those storms were, some pretty large complexes of storms just as the sun was setting. A lot of the haze you saw in the sky in Texas was from the Mexican wildfires here. But if we take a look at the last 24 hours of total accumulated precip through 6 a.m. this morning, we can see the heaviest rains kind of stretching right in through this area. And that's not to take away from some of the bigger events we saw farther to the north. That's a large area that's been hit repeatedly this year. So today, this is the first day in a long time I've not shown you at least a slight risk. You see, the Storm Prediction Center breaks it down into 6 categories: general risk of thunderstorms, marginal risk, slight, enhanced, moderate, and high. And we have areas today we're going to be watching 4 storms, but we are not getting into their slight category, which would be a 15% or greater probability of having hail bigger than an inch, winds over 58 miles an hour, or a tornado. And look, tomorrow, same thing. And then getting out there until day 3. That's 3 days in a row where the biggest risk is only marginal. So I pulled this up this morning from one of my favorite sites out of Iowa State. And it's a calendar for the whole country looking at each day what the maximum risk category was from the Storm Prediction Center. And if you just start today, where we don't have even a slight risk, you have to go back in time. And the last time, all of May had at least a slight risk every day. The last time we didn't have this was here on April 29th. That was the last day where we didn't have at least a slight risk. So I thought you might like to see that statistic. It's been an extremely active spring for severe weather. So at 6:45 this morning, this is what our all hazards map looked like. A lot of wind issues across the northern plains getting back into Montana. Same thing throughout parts of the Great Basin. The excessive heat watches and warnings are still in place across the west and south. And here's the flooding this morning from the complex of storms that's rolled through. If you note, this is just, in fact, let's get an update on this. This is just a quick look at the radar starting late last night, going through early this morning. You can see that large complex of storms here, plus the frontal boundary that kind of rolls. Let's get to the end of that. It kind of rolls right up through this part of the Midwest. Storms coming right in my backyard here pretty soon. But the good news is that I think the model was better initialized, because this is what it was looking like this morning at 7 o'clock, and that's the model initialization. That's much better than it's been recently. So what we're going to see is through the day today, the upper level low curling its way up out of parts of Saskatchewan into Manitoba, and Ontario. And a lot of thunderstorms kind of pivoting around this, but sub-severe, at least based on the current look. And that low just continues through the day tomorrow, pressing those storms into the East Coast, some storms into Florida. And then behind it, things just kind of calm down a bit. The ridge opens up, and that's where we start to see the heat pouring in. Now, I still don't think that this thing lasts too long. Remember, we looked at this yesterday, the Pacific North American pattern. That's the large ridge, peaking somewhere around the 9th or the 10th, and then it backs off. And there's a large spread on its future, but we don't see strong indications we go back into a huge ridge. And I was just watching the pattern in several different models, and I'm just keeping an eye out on this, because through June 7th, 8th, and 9th, there it is. That's that positive PNA, big ridge here. But as we go forward to the 10th, 11th, and 12th, the trough that's in the Gulf of Alaska, it opens up and moves and works its way across the Canadian prairie. So this will be the large ridge to keep an eye on here. But will we start to get storms cascading over the top of this? That's the type of situation. You got to have the heat and the ridge down here to get ridge riding storms, which means toward the middle of the month, I think we could start to see that in this corridor, a lot of ridge riding storms. But out there to day 10 and beyond, we see more troughs coming into the western United States. And at this point in the year, these troughs bring in unsettled weather, but they don't bring in the deep cold. It's not like it's going to go back over cold in that area. But that's a pattern that's showing a lot of resistance to major blocking. I do want to, for completeness, let's go back to the 16th. Let's go quickly look at the European ensemble. I got to switch back to the 0Z run, get you out there to the 16th. So just take note that it too has height lines doing this. So that's not a continuation of the big western ridge. Now, as we walk through each of the models, I want to point out something here important. This is another good test of the AIFS. We've got this drier region in through here, but note how wet it is for this part of the Central Plains into Nebraska. Every model's wet here, and it's got the drier to the north, but that area is way different in the artificial intelligence versus the national blend of models. See that? Now, by the way, I've almost got all these maps done. They're all going to be the same projection, same view, and I hope you like them. But that's the NBM, and this is the WPC, and this is the GFS. Notice this, the European. Big differences in the artificial intelligence model versus every other model. Maybe the GFS has got more of a hint of it. But I think that's a really important thing to be watching here is, do we have a better chance of getting more moisture into Nebraska, just as an example? So let's go have a look at what it looks like by comparing the operational runs of the GFS to the Euro. And as we play this forward, we've seen through Thursday into Friday. We see another possible round of storms coming through on Saturday. Through here, we've watched that all week. The models are in better agreement on their position now through Saturday morning. Getting into Sunday, we know that we're going to have that lingering front. There it is. We talked a lot about that. But take a look at what's coming out of parts of Central America. As the front kind of presses east by early next week, there's flow coming out here, and it's going to start to show up in both models. It is important to note that the GFS has a storm system here that is nowhere to be found in the European model. This will be next Tuesday, dragging a front through the Corn Belt. It's not there in the European. It is there in the GFS. We're already seeing some pretty big divergence in the models a week out, which means I don't know if these models know exactly what to do with this pattern shift. But take a look at this. By the 13th, something's coming out of the Caribbean in the GFS, and there's a lingering front here in the European model, which just needs to be watched pretty carefully. But if you look at the next 7 days in terms of probabilities, this is where we have the best chance in the European ensemble at getting over an inch. So much, much different than what we've seen for the last 8 weeks in terms of how wet things have been in this area. We're still very wet here, though, getting into the Delta Mid-South region. That's where the last kind of parts of these storms are rolling through, plus the lingering front that'll sit there once we get this deeper low over the Great Lakes. On the drier side of it, I'll probably get a new model run here. No, good. On the drier side of it, this is the best chance of staying under a half inch. So I will be watching to see if the European model actually has it right in this area. Excuse me, the European artificial intelligence, to see if it has it right in that area. Going out there to week 2, these are the forecasts from the CPC, the European ensemble, and the GFS ensemble. And take note of this in the GFS ensemble. I show you that because this is the European artificial intelligence week 2, and it's also got a lot of storm activity in this region as well, and drier over the same region where in the next 7 days we expect it to be very wet. So this means mid-month transition, and we're going to have to diagnose it and figure it out and see where it lands us later in the month, but it still seems to be pointing toward a hot and stormy summer. Okay, frost. I told you we're about done with this. That's the least amount I've seen in a long time. Let's now get to the high temperatures. Here's today's highs. Wednesday, just a scorcher in the Central Valley. Tomorrow, same thing. Much more to the Great Basin, though. Cooler air behind the front that's sneaking through the upper Midwest. That's where that low is going to be sitting and spinning over the Great Lakes. So we got the cooler air on the backside. Texas still hot. Then we get into Friday. A lot of 60s here in the lower Michigan. That's going to be chilly. Getting into Saturday and Sunday. Remember, we do have the chance for some storms rolling through the midsection of the country. And then early next week, Monday, Tuesday. That's about the extent of when we expect the big ridge to start to break its way down. So we already start to notice that the day 5 through 10 temperature anomalies are backing off in the west. Just a little bit. Still hot, but backing off. And the day 10 through 15 start to show how that ridge opens up here and the flow starts to return. And that's what could produce much more stormy conditions across the northern tier of the U.S. into the Canadian prairie as we work our way out there toward the middle of the month into week 2. Is the European on board with this? That's day 5 through 10 in the European. And yeah, we kind of see something similar. The GFS, I think, picked up on this change sooner than the European did. So this is a lot of late month heat coming into this area as the ridge starts to just press a bit farther to the east with time. So where I want to finish this is I want to give you that international update on global temperatures, because once again, we watch the models trend even hotter here over the next 10 days. So we're now looking at average temperatures 20 degrees above normal here. Also very hot in parts of northern Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, southern Brazil. And if we look at the precipitation patterns, the European model did back off on the rainfall here, which is something we talked a lot about yesterday. So it looks as though much of eastern Ukraine is going to be dry, while western Ukraine is going to be wet, and the southern Russian wheat belt in through here is going to be relatively dry. Take note of how wet things are going to be in parts of Southeast Asia. And what's interesting about this is I kind of see a couple of fun little stripes here. Do you notice this as well? We've got these interesting areas that are kind of bridging the tropics into the extratropics. And it'll be interesting to follow and understand why they're doing that. I just noticed it a moment ago, so I haven't really diagnosed it much yet, but I think it's all symptomatic of what the transfer of heat and momentum looks like out of the tropics. So we'll leave it there, and we'll talk again tomorrow morning. Appreciate your attention. Thanks.